So formally, I'd like to welcome Mr. John McKeown, Secretary-General of the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, and the two colleagues, your two colleagues with you, Ms. Vaughan and Mr. Flynn. You're very welcome. I'll invite our guests in a few moments to make their presentations to the Joint Committee, and when they've concluded, members will have an opportunity to ask a number of questions. Before that, I wish to draw your attention to the fact, by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And members are reminded of the long-standing practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Once again, colleagues, if you have mobile phones, you might turn them off. They interfere with the meeting and the recording of the meeting. Mr. McKeown, you're very welcome, and I would just officially like to say, in relation to this, to thank you for your cooperation and your attendance at short notice on an issue that has concerned many colleagues. It was raised in the Dáil by Deputy Brady this week. So, Mr. McKeown, if you'd like to make an opening statement, and I'm sure colleagues will have questions for you then.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Chairperson, committee members, I would like to thank the committee for affording me the opportunity to appear before today to update it on the current position with regard to processing illness benefit payments. I am, as you said, joined by my colleagues Anne Vaughan, Deputy Secretary in the Department, and Alan Flynn, Principal in our IT Department. As I said, Chair, in my note to the Clerk of the Committee last week, the Department has experienced significant delays in processing illness benefit payments in recent times, and very regrettably these difficulties have impacted on our customers in a manner that has correctly been described by a number of people, including people in the House, as unacceptable, and we fully accept that. This is a matter of great concern to the Department, and we're extremely disappointed and indeed deeply embarrassed by our failure to maintain our usual standard of service. We are a department that prioritises making payments above all else. In this case, however, we failed to live up to our own standards. We let the people who depend on us down, and although this may be cold comfort to the people affected, we sincerely apologise to all of them. I would like, if I may, to outline the background to the payment issues and the steps we have taken to restore service levels and to ensure as best we can that the payment issues encountered will not be repeated. However, I think it might be useful if I just give a brief overview of the Illness Benefit Scheme to start. The Illness Benefit Scheme is a scheme under which people who are unable to work due to illness or injury are entitled to receive a weekly payment from the Social Insurance Fund. The basic rate of payment for a single person is €198 per week, and entitlement to that payment, which may be made for a period of up to 2 years, is contingent on a person's social insurance record. A person must have a minimum of 104 social insurance contributions paid in order to qualify for up to 12 months of payment, and 260 contributions are required for the full 2-year entitlement. People who exhaust their entitlement to a payment may continue to claim social insurance credits, which are reckonable for pension and other purposes throughout the full 2-year period. Means-tested increases are paid in respect of adult dependents and children. The number of people claiming illness benefit is typically in the order of 50 to 55,000, depending on the season and so on. We tend to have more claims in winter and fewer in summer and so on. Many recipients are not paid directly, but mandate payments to be made to their employer, and expenditure on the scheme is in the order of €600 million per annum. To go into the difficulties that we had, Chair, I think we should refer back to a systems change that we made in August of this year, and the root of the payment difficulties lies in a process and system change, whereby the Department transferred administration of the Illness Benefit Scheme to what we call our Core Business Objects IT platform on the 4th of August last. We had a number of objectives in making that transfer. First, moving the illness benefit payments off an old IT platform which is approaching end of life, to a newer IT platform which is already managing most of the Department's other payments, including, for example, analogous payments like maternity benefit and treatment benefit. Approximately 1.3 million of the Department's 1.6 million weekly scheme payments are already made on this newer platform. The second objective was to try to realise cost savings by eliminating the need for labour-intensive data entry and enabling the reuse of existing customer data already on the Business Objects platform so freeing up staff for assignment to other growing schemes and services. A third objective was to facilitate in due course the move from a paper system whereby people receive medical certificates from their GPs and then post these into the department to one where an e-certificate is transmitted directly from a GP's practice computer system to the department's payment system. And the fourth objective is also to facilitate in due course to move away from a weekly certification regime whereby GPs typically certify illness claims once a week to a system whereby they provide a single certificate covering the entire period of an illness. Although the system change has worked effectively for about 80% of illness benefit customers, a number of significant difficulties arose following the implementation for a number of customers. These included people receiving split or broken payments rather than a single weekly payment for the week, and or missing or indeed not receiving payments on schedule. Customers also faced significant delays in contacting the department's helpline. So there are a number of interrelated factors which I can go through to explain each of these issues. On the split payments issue, as I said, one of the key changes in the new system was the redesign of medical certificates used by GPs. This redesign enabled the forms to be scanned directly into our system rather than relying on manual data entry. However, notwithstanding that this change had been agreed with the Irish Medical Organisation, approximately 50% of GP practices initially continued to submit old form certificates. This created a problem on our data entry, which in turn led to long delays in claim processing on the new system in early August. In order to overcome these delays, the Department implemented what is known as an automatic certification process to ensure that people, including those whose GPs were not submitting the correct certificates, still got paid. While the process did ensure customers received their payments, it also resulted in approximately 15% of customers receiving a split payment in the period from September through to November. It's important to note that people who receive split payments were not underpaid as a consequence of this approach. The total amount paid, albeit may have been paid over 1 or 2 or 3 payments in some cases, was in accordance with their entitlement. During this time, and in addition to implementing a temporary process of auto-certification, the Department decided and did deploy additional staff to process the old form certificates received from GP practices, and we continued and worked with the main representative body for GPs to encourage greater use of the new system. This meant that in mid-October we were in a position to cease the auto-certification process, and the issue of split payments has since been largely resolved. At this point in time, approximately 75% of medical certificates being received are in the correct format, and that means that we can process the balance of forms at 25% on the day they are received. I wish now to go on to the issue of missed payments and late payments. While resolving the split payments issue, the removal of the auto-certification process belatedly exposed some underlying deficiencies in the design and operation of the illness benefit system. It's not unusual that issues with the operation of a new system will be identified in the week or so immediately following a go-live implementation, and these would then normally be resolved before too many people are affected. However, in this case, because we implemented an auto-certification process, this in effect camouflaged the underlying system issues for a period of time. And by the time the process was ceased in mid-October, over a month of transactions had already been impacted, and as a consequence, in each subsequent week up to last week, payments to approximately 10% of illness benefit recipients were delayed by a week or more, and in some cases significantly more. The main issue that has been identified, which is underlying, which had been camouflaged by the auto-certification process with the new system, relates to the transition from a payment in arrears approach to a current week payment approach. In other words, from a system whereby people are paid their entitlement the week after a period of certification to one where they are paid during the week of certification. Although this change speeds up initial payment, it leaves very little tolerance for late receipt of certificates once a claim is actually in payment. This is because if a certificate is not received early in the week to which it refers, then payment will not reach the customer until the earliest the following week. By contrast, under the old payment in arrears method, there was in effect a 7-day buffer to receive certificates and still get them into payment on a 1 payment a week schedule. Although under both systems of operation, a customer will receive the same total payment amount over the course of an illness, the propensity of the current week system to create payment gaps is causing significant uncertainty for and distress to customers. Another issue with the new system, which became apparent once we removed the auto-certification process, is that it has very tightly defined rules which must be satisfied before a certificate can be accepted and processed for payment. Although these rules are valid in principle, they are leading to payments being delayed for reasons that would not have been applied under the legacy system. So, as an example, if there is a gap of a week or more between the dates on 2 certificates, the new system will not consider the second certificate as part of a continuing claim, but will require a new claim to be submitted. This then leads to the payment being stopped and referred for examination as a task to an officer of the department. And they're the 2 main issues which are underlying the system, which have been hidden in some respects by the auto-certification process. We're taking 3 main steps to resolve the issues just described. First, we have and are continuing to deploy additional staff to process the tasks and respond to the customer inquiries arising from the tight application of scheme rules by the new system. As new staff being deployed to support illness benefit processing do need to be trained on the scheme and on the system, the measures will take some time to deliver full benefit, but we are beginning to see the benefit of that additional deployment now. Second, we have developed some new IT routines or workarounds that in effect build the 7-day buffer that was in the former system back into the new system, and also automate the processing of tasks which are generated by the application of the rules to ensure a faster flow through the payment. Finally, we are reviewing the design rules in the system, including the payment in the current week rule, and will modify the system to afford greater flexibility in processing of claims and certificates. And in addition, we're continuing to engage with the medical profession regarding the implementation of e-certification and single or closed certification. These measures will, in time, and if we can agree them, lead to better customer service. The Department has also allocated additional managers to the division to take responsibility for the programme of work just set out. The management team includes a full-time assistant secretary, additional staff at principal, assistant principal and higher executive officer level. As a consequence of the measures just described, customers who are due a payment and whose certificates and claims are in order should now be receiving their payment entitlement. Payment volumes were restored to normal levels last week and will continue to be monitored on a daily basis to ensure that they remain at this level. Any further issues that may arise will be quickly identified, and any further remedial action that may be required will be taken. In stating this, it is important to note that there are always cases, and were always such cases under the old system, where customer payments are legitimately stopped or paused. For example, if medical certificates are incorrectly completed, or if the certifying GP is not registered on our system, or if there is an inconsistency between an illness benefit claim and another social welfare claim and payment, or indeed if we make routine errors in the processing of certificates. These type of issues will always remain and would normally be dealt with via our helpline number. Unfortunately, as deputies will be aware, due to the large volumes of calls being received over recent weeks, customers are facing difficulties in contacting the department. We expect the measures set out above will both reduce the volume of calls and increase our call handling capacity in coming weeks. And again, we've seen the impact of that this week when we're not quite back to normal at this point in time in terms of the volume of calls or speed of response, but we're a lot closer to it than we were a week ago. In addition to these system issues, the Department acknowledges that it did not communicate effectively with customers in advance of the new system coming into effect, nor did we act quickly enough to advise and reassure them as to the nature of the split payment issue, or to respond in a timely and effective manner to the instance of missed and delayed payments. While I did write to all of our illness benefit customers some weeks ago to apologise for the difficulties they're encountering and advise them of other supports available, this communication was, I accept, too little, too late, and was of limited comfort to those people who were affected. Although the Department has previously successfully transferred most of its other schemes and payments onto the Business Objects platform, and although the development and testing process for this system followed previous practice, our experience with illness benefit transfer has been a salutary reminder that the longer-term impact of short-term remedial actions taken with the best intentions when unanticipated issues arise or failures occur must be carefully thought through before implementation. In order to ensure that this and other lessons should be learned from this experience are identified and learned, I have commissioned an independent review of this project. The review has been undertaken by a retired Revenue Commissioner and will be delivered directly to me and to the Minister. It is expected that it will be delivered by the end of the year, and its findings will inform our approach to future system and process changes. As I have already said, Chair, the Department sincerely regrets and is deeply embarrassed by the difficulties recently encountered by illness benefit customers. We have let some of our customers down, and for this we are very sorry. In mitigation, if there can be any, I would point to the fact that the Department has a strong record of ensuring customers get paid. This is the first incident of its kind in a long programme of transferring over 1.6 million weekly payments from old legacy systems to our newer business object system, and throughout this experience we continue to successfully deliver over 99% of payments on time. We also deployed the Community Welfare Service to help assist customers who face difficulties arising from the payment issues, and many customers were supported with interim payments through this service. This is not in any way to diminish or understate the extent of the illness benefit issues. So again, I would like to apologise not just to customers but also to our staff who have been under significant pressure throughout all of this, and to Oireachtas members for the difficulties experienced. We have done better in the past, we can do better again, and we are determined to do so. My colleagues and I, Chair, will be pleased to take any questions the committee members may have.
Thank you very much, Mr McKeown, for your opening statement. Before I open it to the meeting to questions, I just have one general question that arose from this. And you set out, I suppose, in some detail the technical issues and the IT and the change of that. But one of the real issues that arose for all of us in the public was lack of information, lack of access. They couldn't get through on the phones, or we couldn't get through either. I suppose the question I'd like to ask you specifically is, at what stage did you realise there were significant difficulties in this? Because you do go on to say very specifically, the department deployed additional staff to process old form certificates received from GPs. Why was there not additional support provided in terms of telephone communications to respond to people? Because you clearly knew there was a problem at that point in time, but yet the communications, and it was the frustration that people were experiencing of not knowing was there a problem with their particular one. In the beginning, when people came to me, I thought there were individuals who were having problems, not that there was a systemic issue. If you want to comment on that, and then...
Yeah, I can do that. As I said, Deputy, there are in effect three separate issues which came together. The first issue was the continued submission of old form certificates, and our immediate response to that was to put in the auto-certification process. So that generated a number of calls initially in August. When we implemented the auto-certification process, we could see the call volumes dropped pretty quickly thereafter between August into September, from September through to the middle of October. The immediate issue then arose when we removed the auto-certification process, which revealed the underlying system issues which we hadn't seen up to that point. It was at that stage that the call volumes really went through the roof, and the staff we had just weren't capable of responding to the calls. We had a choice. We could have taken staff out of processing activities and put them on calls, but that would have just delayed payments further. The decision we took was to put extra staff on the phones. Now, the issue, this was mid-October, so the issue that arises is, in order to put extra staff on the phones, they're only useful if they can answer the queries. So they need to be trained on the system and on the scheme, on both the IT system and the scheme, and it's taken some time to do that. You can't just put, if you just put people on the phone and all they do is answer the phone and say, well, I can't help you, it's not much use. So there was a lead time of about 2 weeks to get staff in and get them going, and we fully accept that the communications on this has been one of the key failures that we're going to have to address.
Thank you, Mr McKeown. Deputy Brady.
Glad to have the officials in here to have the opportunity to voice the outrage that thousands of our citizens, people who are entitled to this money, have experienced since August. And I've been raising this issue consistently on the floor in here, with emails, correspondence to the Minister, and all going unanswered. And if those are going unanswered to me, I can only imagine how the many thousands of people out there who've been directly impacted on this actually feel. It's been an unmitigated disaster on so many different areas that it's hard to know where actually to begin with this. You know, certainly the department hasn't covered themselves in glory in this. I hear what you're saying. You're right to apologise. You're right to apologise. And I know many people out there directly impacted on this will find it very hard to actually take that apology, because this has forced some of the sickest people in the state into so many different precarious situations, you know, into debt, into, you know, jeopardising their tenancies with landlords, and, you know, so many other areas there. As I said, it's actually hard to know where to begin with this. Back in August, there was an attempt by the department to lay the blame on some GPs, you know, and that's where all of this starts, you know, because at the outset, there was no consultation. with many GPs, with any GPs in the rollout of the new certification, and that's where a lot of the problems actually arose from initially. So, you know, I'll ask the question as to whether those issues, those concerns that many GPs actually have, as to whether those have all been addressed. I had previously made calls to the Minister to engage with those GPs who she had turned her back on. She had failed to answer correspondence, failed to engage with them. So can I ask as to whether she has actually engaged with those GPs who hadn't been consulted in the rollout of the new certification? The issues you say were masked up until October, and I find that hard to believe because from the outset, there was people contacting my office, and I can only imagine contacting the offices of all TDs, members of the Oireachtas. Some people were actually getting overpaid. And they were wondering, geez, now am I going to be chased up now? Am I going to be, you know, targeted as a welfare cheat, you know, and you know, named and shamed, you know? So it put those people in serious situations. Many people not getting any payments, as I said. And then there was, you know, a line from the department that, you know, yes, there are issues here. Go to your local CWO, community welfare officer, you know, on any payments. You know, they will ensure that people, you know, who are at a shortfall will ensure that they get some money. But people were going down to the community welfare officer, and the community welfare officers in many cases were saying, look, because you're getting a par payment, you're not entitled to a penny off of us. So sorry about that, off you go. And I've been contacted by many people. One very ill woman had to travel many miles from Blessington all the way into Tala, where her local community welfare officer is, only to be told, no, you're not getting a penny here. You're getting a par payment, off you go on your way. She had to struggle on. So can I ask as to at what stage, because I had passed it on to the department, that community welfare officers, because there is that discretion there from officer to officer, was there a directive issued to all community welfare officers at any stage that if somebody presents who is entitled to illness benefit and they're not getting a full payment, was there a directive given to community welfare officers to ensure that every person entitled to money actually got the full entitlement from the welfare officer? There's issues there. Again, the Minister, I questioned her the other day, she said everyone now is receiving payment. She issued a statement last Friday saying everyone will get a payment, their full payment, on Friday or over the weekend at the latest. And it was only through the intervention, it appears, of RTE and the Joe Duffy show that forced her actually to take action. You know, because on Monday, many callers to Liveline were saying, look, that's not true. I still haven't received a payment. And there was many people that were contradicting what the Minister had said the previous Friday. So can I ask as to whether everyone that is entitled to a payment now is getting their full payment? And just two more quick points here. And the issue then of underpayments. Again, the Minister says that underpayments, they will be sorted out in the coming period. When exactly will people who are entitled to, to receive money that they're due, when exactly will those payments be made? And can I just say, just in relation to the communications, the non-existent communications, and I will defend all the staff in the department in the illness benefit section, because it put those staff in an absolute horrible situation that they, I'm sure many received abuse from people, people who are angry, people who are in those precarious situations that they were put in through this unmitigated disaster. And you say it was only at that stage, mid-October or late October, that staff were being trained on the system. That is absolute madness. So just final point here. This system was introduced in August. Was the system trialled before it actually went live? Was it actually trialled? Because that would be the logical thing, you know, to have happened. So can I ask that? And the final thing here, I just want to raise. Sorry, here, look. Look, I'll come back to it there. I just can't see it at the moment. So if you could answer those questions. I mean, it's been an unmitigated disaster. An apology is the very least.
Thank you, Deputy Brady. Mr. McKeown, I'll come to you in a moment, but there are a number of other questions, so I'll take them all together. Deputy Collins.
Thanks very much, Chair. Mr. McKeown, I think this is probably one of the biggest operations in relation to transfer of an old system into a new system. And the first question I wanted to ask was the question that Deputy Brady put forward there was this trialled? How long was it trialled for? Who was it trialled with? Because I would have presumed that bringing something like this in, after you saying here that you had got agreement with the GPs in relation to this, it doesn't seem like you did, or the GPs didn't know that they were changing to e-certification. But if I was introduced, and I'm not saying this in hindsight, I've worked it on post and I know things can go disastrously wrong when you bring in new systems, but they had to be trialled, and it would have been, to my mind, the practical thing to do was to get a cohort of GPs, after agreement with the representation group, to introduce the system first, see how it went, get them onto the e-certificates, and see if there was any potential problems that you've raised in relation to the system and the split payments and all that. And they could have been highlighted at that stage, but it seems that you brought in a whole new system without having looked at the possibility of problems that could arise from that system. And at the end of the day, and I know you've apologised profusely, and I take that on board and I'm sure people listen to it, but at the end of the day, I am dealing with people who are borrowing money from their family to try and keep going, and only that the family has the money to give them, and they'd be absolutely lost. They're in digs, they're in rented accommodation, and we've left people, vulnerable people, very, very vulnerable, even more vulnerable than they have been. And I think that in itself has to be taken on board, and I'm very angry about it, and I know other people are very angry about it. So to me, that's the key thing. Communications seemed to be very slow in realising what was going on from August till mid-September. And I know then you had to train people in, because you can't just put people on phones or whatever just without having the information, which would have been even worse. But it seemed to be the case that the new system was brought in. There was no question or discussion or team evaluation of, if that happens, have we got the staff to bring in, if, whatever, because it was a huge change in the system, just a huge change in the system. And the fact that 50% of GPs weren't even, linking in with the system, or didn't know about it, or hadn't been informed about it. And that's what I'm saying, that I know you have you've set up with the Revenue Commissioner to look at what has happened about the implementation, and but I do think that at this stage, if there's anybody, because I know I'm getting emails from people still that haven't got payment, they're saying they hadn't got the payment from October the 3rd, the 10th, the 17th, the 24th, 31st and November the 7th, and they got a CWO payment of 196 in that period. I mean, the CWOs should be instructed, if anybody hasn't got payment after, a period of time, a week, they should be paying immediately, whether they got part payment or whatever, and we should be getting that message out to people to go into their entry offices and get payment from the CWO, and that instruction should go out to every CWO in the system, and that people should not be left vulnerable. They should not be left vulnerable. I did get people in that had been overpaid, and I had to email the TD rep thing to say that the person, they had the cheques sitting in the drawer, they hadn't cashed them obviously, and then they were obviously afraid, as been said, that they'd be done for one of the be defiled as a person who is doing the system. So I think there's so many questions here, and I know things can't be, if the system is not working still for people, it's still not working for people, that we must put in place something immediately that people can get paid. at least a minimum of what the payment would be every week if once they can produce a cert to the CWO and check on the system. And the other question I wanted to raise before I finished is weekly certs. Heretofore was did the illness benefit section seek weekly certs all the time? Because I know you can't go into detail with anybody. For example, a person who is on illness benefit and they're retired in October, they're going every week now to a doctor to get and paying €15 to get a prescription or a cert to send over to the entry office. Now, I dealt with the case and I was talking to somebody very good on the phone on Monday, and they advised that there has been a change now. You can actually certify up to 6 months, and the illness benefit section will accept that. But I haven't seen anything on it. I haven't seen anything written on it, so that we can actually even give to somebody to bring that to the GP and say, well, you can give me, if I'm not going to be able to get back to, whatever, in five weeks, give me a monthly cert or whatever, But I think we really let people down, and I wouldn't call people customers. They're people that rely on our social welfare system when they're sick to get paid regularly, and I think we really, it's not good.
Collins. Deputy Smith.
Thank you. Thanks for your statement. And obviously the apology is welcome, but I don't think giving it to us is not sufficient. And I would like to know if you have given this apology to every single individual affected and every single person in receipt of illness benefit. In other words, have they been written to or phoned? Have your department spoken to them and really explained to them how you've explained to us that your system went belly up? But there's more explanations are required, and that is what instructions were immediately given to the local Intrio offices, to the CWOs, the community welfare officers, because we had clients coming in who couldn't get information, apart from not being able to get information on the phone or receiving any letters from their department. They could not get through to the Intrio offices to get clear information. They didn't seem to have been instructed as to what to tell clients as to what was going on. People who, as has been said, very vulnerable, very people without a safety net. It's not like, if I missed a payment, I'd manage. I've got a bit of a safety net there. Most people who have jobs would have a little bit of a safety net, but when you're entirely dependent on a payment from social protection, you don't have any. So you live from day to day, from week to week, and this should have been alerted to the CWOs immediately, who should have been told, prioritise these individuals, make sure you get back to them and that you pay them what's required that they're missing. And I'd like to know what instructions were given to the local offices and to the CWOs. Finally, to ask you, will you ensure that every single person gets a communication from your department with that apology and with that explanation and with instructions what to do should this happen again? Because the system's failed once, it may fail twice or 3 times indeed. And I know you can't guarantee us that that won't happen, because you couldn't guarantee in the initial implementation of the system that it wouldn't fail. And so me sitting here getting an apology from you really isn't good enough. It needs to go out to those people who are most affected and most vulnerable.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. Deputy Carey.
Thanks very much, Chair. Firstly, I welcome your attendance here today and the clarity you've brought to this particular issue. I welcome your apology. The systems breakdown has caused damage to people, vulnerable people, who are very much reliant on this particular payment. And I think the chairman has put his finger on it at the outset. The lack of communications and the inability of people to get information from officials, certainly added to the distress to people. If problems, have been identified and they are being fixed, why do some people not in receipt of the payment as of yet? Could you answer that, please? And could you answer what is the position with regards to arrears payments? And just, I suppose, in a general point, say for other payments, transitioning to a new platform such as this, have you any other plans to move other payments onto this platform or a similar platform as you outlined was the situation with this particular payment.
Deputy Carey. Mr McKeown, just before you respond, I suppose I want to make one observation or one comment. You have indicated that a retired Revenue Commissioner is doing a review, and I think that's really, really important. I suppose a department as big as yourselves in terms of number of transactions and whatever, there is always the potential for something to go wrong. I think the real critical issue is how do you deal with it when something occurs. And the communication and the void was really the problem. People were scared, didn't know what was happening. We couldn't get answers, they couldn't get answers. And I hope that the review, we can't be critical of changing to a new IT and a glitch occurring. That can happen. It's how you deal with it. And our concern, or my personal concern, was for a number of months that there was no clarity around what was happening. There was no, we were getting case after case, phone after phone not being answered. So I hope that the review focuses on, what are the, apart from identifying risks and potentials, when something goes wrong, what are the immediate steps that you take to deal with the public? And the concern I have in this particular case was that while it goes back to August, it took a long time before the scale of it became apparent, and probably in terms of communications and whatever, it took a while. And I hope that the review addresses that specifically. A number of colleagues have touched on it, and you just might clarify where we are today in terms of outstanding legacy issues. So people who are either feel they're overpaid or underpaid or haven't been processed, where you are with that. And because deputies have said people have received payments and they're not sure if they're their money or not. And by and large, we often talk about people are conscientious. They don't want to spend something that isn't theirs. They worry about it. So those legacy issues, where are we today? Mr McCall.
There's been a lot of questions, Chair, so I'll try to go through them all, and if I skip one or miss one, you'll remind me, please. On the GP issue and the consultation with GPs, we have been and had been talking to GPs going back to 2016 on this changeover. We've been dealing with the Irish Medical Organisation. As deputies will be aware, the Irish Medical Organisation is the only recognised body representing GPs that's affiliated with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and has a negotiating licence. And there's been a public policy dating back to the 1970s that we should only deal with people that have formal recognition. That's not to say we didn't deal with the newer organisation, the NAGP. We had some contact with them, but obviously our communications and our consultation on this was with the primary body, the Irish Medical Organisation. And we had agreed with that organisation to implement the change in August, and indeed the organisation wrote to its members on the 10th of July advising them that the change was happening and encouraging them to cooperate and work with the change. That's not to say that the other organisation didn't agree with that approach and didn't go public and say, well, we think doctors shouldn't, and that caused confusion among doctors. But we've worked with the IMO and we've had a long number of meetings with them over the past number of months, and we're now in a situation where 75% of certificates are in the new form. It was very unfortunate, and perhaps we should have done more to engage with the National Association of GPs, which is the organisation, but we're in a somewhat difficult situation in that they're not recognised, they don't have a negotiating licence, they're not affiliated with ICTU, and we'd also be in a situation where you could be possibly the meat and the sandwich between two different rival organisations. So we followed the line which all public sector organisations do. We deal with the appropriate representative body, and that did cause us difficulties. The other issue that arose was with regard to the overpayments, and that goes back, deputies, to the decision we took to auto-certify people when we were faced with a situation where we're getting a lot of old form certificates which couldn't be processed efficiently under the new system. What we ask all people that are in receipt of illness benefit do is submit a final certificate to us. So what we did is we processed all final certificates, including those that came in on final certificates. The balance that we hadn't processed, we didn't know, was it because the person was no longer ill, or was it because they were caught up in this issue with GPs submitting old forms? So the decision we took was to pay people where there wasn't a final certificate submitted, knowing that in some cases that would generate an overpayment. We're not going to go chasing those people in any insensitive way. We have a project set up and we propose to do it next year, where we'll do it in a managed and sensitive way to recover those overpayments. On the community welfare service, if there have been examples where the community welfare service didn't operate in the way it should have done, please send them to me. We did issue a direction very early on that the community welfare service should support people with illness benefit, and that directive was given. Some of the examples I've seen are examples, and I'm not saying this is the general by any means, but that have come to me have been people who presented to a community welfare officer, and the community welfare officer was able to see that in fact they had received their payment. That the person mightn't have received it that way, but he could see that they had received, and then there was no gap. In other cases, there have been gaps, and maybe the community welfare service didn't respond as appropriate. But I can say that throughout all of this period, the community welfare service has been supporting about 3,000 people a week with illness benefit interim payments, which would be proportionate to the number of people who are actually affected. If there are examples, Deputy, send them directly to me. We'll deal with them, because some of these issues, it's only when you work through an individual example that you can see a flaw that maybe we're not aware of, that there is a gap. So send them directly to my office, and we'll investigate. And if there is some kind of issue that we're not picking up, we'll rectify it. As I said in my opening statement, we'll rectify it immediately. But the directive has been given. With regard to the issue of arrears payments, I suppose there are two issues that arise with regard to arrears. One is what we call overlaps, and the other is arrears. So I'll deal with the overlaps first. The overlap issue arises where somebody got a supplementary welfare allowance or community welfare service officer payment in lieu of their illness benefit payment. When we bring their illness benefit payment up to date, as we've now done, it will offset the amount which is due on illness benefit against the amount which is paid. So the customer will get a reduced payment. And that's been a source of some confusion as well, because people think, oh, I'm owed 5 weeks illness benefit, but I only got this amount. And we have to explain to them, well, actually, but you also got this other amount during that 5-week period, so we've netted it off, and that's a source of confusion. But that's the overlapping payment issues. In terms of arrears where people were not paid at all, the arrears payments in most cases have issued, and we're running a routine this week to pick up any subsequent arrears that haven't been paid, and they should be paid very, very shortly. There was a question raised about people who are still not on payment. We're satisfied that payment levels are back to normal. There will, as I said in my opening statement, always be cases where people are not on payment for one reason or another. The examples, and again, I've gone through a number of examples myself, because I'm getting, obviously, directly into my office a lot of calls and queries as well. In most cases, I won't say in every case, but in most cases, there are issues where there are genuine problems. They wouldn't have been getting paid under the old system no more, and they're problems that need to be sorted. But there are problems with, I'll give you an example. One I received this week was a person who thought they'd been certified for a month, but the doctor, instead of saying the 26th of September to the 3rd of November, had done the 26th of September to the 3rd of September. They'd written the wrong date on the system. We didn't know that the person was expecting a payment for a month, but we could only operate on the basis of the 3rd. Now, we fixed it, but they're the issues which would normally be coming into our phone line that would normally be dealt with and would normally be fixed over the phone. But people were caught up, not, as you said, definitely able to get through to the phone to sort out those issues. Just for information, we process 9,000 certificates a day. So even if you get 99%, perfection, which would be extremely high in this type of operation, most analogous operations would be aimed for 95%, you're going to have a few hundred a day that, for one reason or another, don't flow perfectly. And that was always there. So we would always, even in the best of days under the old system, we'd be receiving 2,000 calls a day from people. And as I said, they'd be sorted out. The issue this time, I suppose, is that we've received a lot more calls, and it's now getting back to that run of operation where people are missing payments for potentially legitimate reasons. When you look at the circumstance, that we can sort them out quickly. So the payment issues at the moment are not, we believe, to do with the system change. They're to do with, I suppose, the fallout from that in terms of getting back on top of all the phone calls and getting back on top of all the routine issues. But again, what I'd encourage deputies to do, if you have individual examples yourself, send them to me, because I'm very concerned that if there are any underlying systematic issues which we haven't picked up at this stage, that I identify them and fix them. But we've spent days and nights and weekends at this, so we're pretty confident we're back to normal operations, other than the clean-up, and there are people caught up in the clean-up. With regard to the communication, I fully accept what everybody has said. The communication has been poor on this. In the initial, I mean, I suppose one of the things, most people who are on illness payment are on it for a short period of time. So writing out to all of them in advance, knowing that 70% of them are not going to be illness benefit customers by the time they received the letter. But that wasn't, it was a bad call. We should have written out to them nonetheless. It was a bad call, fully accept that. We should have written out to customers when the split payment issue happened because of the auto-certification and explained to them, yes, you might have got a payment of 165 and yes, you might have got a payment of 33, but when you add them together, they're 198 and are paid up to a certain date, and that this problem is going to continue. So please try to get your certificates in as early as possible, in a week, because we're now on a current week basis. So if you don't get them in early in the week, because a lot of people who are in continuous payment are, they knew the payment was in arrears, they knew they had a kind of a 7-day or a week buffer to get their certs in, and then that disappeared from them. And we should have communicated that, fully accept that. With regard to the staff training and the testing of the system, if I talk about the testing of the system first, we tested this system in exactly the same way we've tested all of our other systems, in a way that worked successfully for us in every other system change that we've made. And as I said, we've moved 1.3 million payments, pensions, child benefit, maternity, paternity, treatment benefit onto this system, and we haven't had this incident before. So we followed exactly the same testing routine. We also, in terms of trialling it, we ran existing certs that were in payment through the system to see that it paid them, and it did. And we took an early implementation of it with the partial capacity benefit programme, which is an analogous programme which went and worked well. I could go into the reasons why I think that training didn't work, but if I could ask maybe indulgence of the committee, we have commissioned the independent review. I don't want to be seen to prejudice what that person will find, and if I say what I think, I might be seen to be, kind of leading him. But there were issues, I think, with the testing, which I think we will learn from. But I don't want to say something and then be seen, well, the independent review wasn't as independent as it should have been. So if I could seek the indulgence of the committee, if I could on that. With the staff training, yes, I think we could and should have done better on the staff training. That's been a point that our staff has made very strongly to us. Again, I would say that the training that was delivered to staff was the same as the training that was delivered in every other scheme. What the point you made, Deputy, or maybe Deputy Collins, when things go wrong, did we plan for things going wrong? And I suppose in reality we didn't. We planned for things going right. And normally, for those people who've been involved, if you do a systems change and it works well in terms of the implementation, and then staff have the training they get is sufficient because they then develop confidence in the system and confidence in the real life. But when you're staff that are suddenly hit with volumes and volumes of calls, you don't have the ability, having gone live, to kind of get confidence in the system. So I think one of the learnings from this is to plan for failure rather than plan for success. And I think, if there's ever an example of you learn more from your mistakes than your successes, this is it, because perhaps our successes on the other schemes maybe led to a level of complacency that there wouldn't be a failure, and then that's where, so and hands up on that. There was a point made about people who are going to doctors and the doctors charging them for certs. Doctors should not be charging people for certs. We pay the doctors. So doctors should be charging people for certs, and that's very clear. Doctors who are charging people for certs are pulling a fast one, I would say. I don't believe it's widespread, by the way, but they shouldn't be charging people for certs. I was asked, did we write to all people to apologise? I wrote, I think it's about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, I wrote to everybody and I apologised and I explained as best I could in a letter. Obviously, you couldn't send a letter at the length of my opening statement what had happened, and it pointed to the availability of the Community Welfare Service. I won't say I'm happy to do so again, because you're never happy in this situation, but if people feel it'd be appropriate to do another letter, I'm absolutely prepared to do that. So in terms of plans for other payments, at this point in time, the main payments that are not on the system, and you can be assured we'll be taking these steps very, very, very carefully, are job seekers payments and single parent, lone parent payments. So we'll be taking these very, very carefully. The illness benefit scheme, as I said, has 55,000 people on it. Those other two schemes have much more. So there is a silver lining in this. At least we learned our lessons in some respect. And it's not. I'm not trying to mitigate the impact or say anything, but I think if we'd affected lone parents, the numbers, and it's just purely about the numbers, not the individual circumstances, or job seekers. It would have been a whole different order of magnitude. So we will definitely take the lessons from this to make sure that those implementations go properly.
Thank you, Mr. McKeown. I'm conscious of the time, so if you have a short comment, I'll take from anybody. Deputy Brady first.
Just a couple of points. Just in relation to the independent review, and I think that is going to be critical here, because you use the words complacent and all of these other things. But the important thing is that lessons are learned. So I would be interested to hear the terms of reference for that independent review. Because I think it's important that in that review, they don't just look at the systems failure, but also there's a critical analysis carried out on how the department actually responded to it. So I think the terms of reference could be sent around, but also if that review will be made public, because I think it would be critical for this committee to have a look at, because you did state there that job seekers and lone parents are going to be put on that same system as well. So I think it would be very useful for us to have a look at that. Just two final points here. I would imagine there were highly paid consultants engaged in the rollout of this. And I would be interested in hearing at what stage those highly paid consultants identified problems with the system in which they were tasked at rolling out. So maybe if you could just touch on that. And the final thing there, just in relation to the arrears, I would be interested in hearing how many people are still in arrears, you say some have been sorted out at this stage. I think you said you're hopeful that the rest will be sorted over the rest of this week. So how many people were in arrears, and what percentage of those still haven't received, and can we get a categorical assurance that all of those will be paid by the end of business tomorrow?
Deputy Smith.
Yeah, I'm just curious about one. I suppose it's a small point, but it might be significant, and it's to do with how you deal with the GPs through the IMO and you're not through the other organisation, because they don't have recognition, and I get that. But would it not, in a situation like this, be prudent to deal directly with every single GP? Because you must have them on a database somewhere, because every cert has the GP's name and clinic and address on it. And in a case like this, would it not have been more an insurance certificate for yourself? We've covered everybody, we've covered everything, they all know, rather than worrying about one organisation not being able to deal with the other. Or indeed there might be GPs who aren't members of either.
Deputy Carey.
Chairman, thanks very much. Just in relation to the independent review, when do you anticipate that you'll have a report back in relation to that? Thanks.
Over to you.
Sorry, just if I can talk about the independent review, we will certainly send the terms of reference, and they do cover the matters which you spoke about and the communications issue, Chair, which you raised. And we'll be happy to circulate those. I'm just waiting for the Commissioner to come back to sign off on them, but as soon as he does, I'll send them. I don't see a difficulty. He's I don't know if he's out of the country. He's travelling this week. Yes, I won't say he's travelling, but I'll be talking to him next week. So as soon as they're signed off, I'll send them to you. We won't have a difficulty with them being published in due course. In terms of the timing, we would hope that we would have it by the end of the year. That's our intention. But I think the most important thing is to get it done properly. This has been a big project. It was 2 years in the making. There's a huge amount of paperwork in terms of programme reports, systems designs, testings and so on that he'll obviously have to review. He'll have to interview and talk to all the people involved. I will take his opinion on how much time he needs to do it properly rather than rushing to an outcome. But the important thing here, I think, as an improved set, is the learnings. But we would hope that it will be done by the end of the year. The other question which was raised was the consultants. Yes, the system was designed and built by a specialist firm of consultants who were procured by open tender. And that's certainly one of the issues we'll be looking at as part of the review. Because, I mean, I want to be clear, I'm the accounting officer for the department. I'm accountable for operations. I've got to account for this. I'm not looking to transfer responsibility in any way, but certainly it's something I'm very keen to get to, is what could and should have been done better in that space as well. So that will form part of it. The arrears, as I said, we're running a routine this week to try and pick up those who haven't got the arrears. I can't give the absolute categoric assurance you looked for, because you never know until we do it. But we would be hopeful that everybody this week or next week, and that's what I said earlier, would get their arrears. But we're still working on that. And if there are cases, you know, if you can give them to me, the sooner the better, because if there are issues that are systemic, we believe we've identified them all, we believe we've sorted them all, but if there are issues which we're not aware of, you know, get them to us as soon as possible, and then that improves the prospects.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKeown. Mr. McKeown, Ms. Vaughan, Mr. Flynn, thank you for your attendance today. Before I conclude, first of all, I'd like to thank you for not just your attendance, but I suppose your frank and honest and direct answer to the questions. Secondly, to acknowledge that from the point of view of the members here present, that you clearly indicated if there were specific cases that are unresolved, that they should be directed to you from the members here. And I think that was an important thing. I also think it's worth acknowledging that, I suppose, apart from the you understand the depth of feeling from members here, the distress that this caused to people, and I think quite clearly you acknowledged that when the problem occurred, communications and the lack of contingency planning obviously have presented difficulties. And I hope that as the rollout for future programmes, that they're built in, that, you know, what if something doesn't, so both in terms of communications and contingency planning, and hopefully they will be reflected in the review that is going forward. I think it's also fair to acknowledge and to put on the record that you are in a public forum here today, and that your apology is a public apology. And I think we should acknowledge that. You have written, as you've said, to those who are affected. It's a number that fluctuates because, as you say, people are in and out of the system. But your apology here today should be recognised as a public apology, and I do acknowledge that. Deputy Smith, briefly.
Sorry, because you didn't comment on my question about GPs and communication. I'll accept that in writing because I know we're in a hurry, if you wouldn't mind.
But yes, I can, absolutely. Sorry, Deputy. I didn't, sorry, I just missed it on the notes. Yeah, I'm sorry.
If you write to me, I'll
yeah, and we did write to all GPs, but I can give you the details.
Yeah, grand.
Okay.
Once again, thank you for your attendance today. Colleagues, we're going to adjourn for a couple of moments and we will resume in public session with our next set of witnesses then. Thank you very much. public session, so I would like to welcome Patricia Murphy, Assistant Secretary of the Department, with her colleagues Mr Riley, Mr Sheridan, Mr Lynch and Mr McCamley. You're all very welcome. I'll invite our guests to make their presentations to the Joint Committee in a few moments, and then I'll offer members an opportunity to ask a number of questions. However, before that, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Committee. However, if you're directed by the Committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name, or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And members are reminded of the long-standing practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Colleagues, if you have mobile phones, you might either switch them off or to flight mode. And at this stage, Ms Murphy, if you would like to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the invitation to attend the Joint Committee on the issue of false self-employment. Firstly, just to make some introductions, I'm Patricia Murphy. I'm the Assistant Secretary in the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, with responsibility for HR, facilities and estates management, employment rights policy, PRSI policy, including scope section. I'm joined by Sean Riley and Christopher McCamley, who deal with PRSI policy and scope section in the department. Dermot Sheridan has responsibility for employment rights policy, and Jim Lynch is the divisional manager for our Midwest division, whose responsibilities include social welfare inspections in that area. False or bogus self-employment, as we know, arises where an employer willfully and wrongly treats an employee as a self-employed contractor in order to avoid tax and social insurance contributions and other employment rights which attach to employment. There are robust arrangements in place for dealing with complaints of bogus or false self-employment. Social welfare inspectors inspect a wide range of businesses as part of their ongoing compliance operations. Inspections are also undertaken jointly with other agencies, including the Revenue Commissioners and Workplace Relations Commission. Where evidence of non-compliance is detected, this will be pursued. Officials investigate specific cases referred to in the Department's scope section. Scope section determines employment status and the correct class of pay-related social insurance. Where misclassification of workers as self-employed is detected, the correct status and class is determined, and social insurance arrears are collected as required. Where determination is made that a worker has been incorrectly classified as self-employed, the employer will be required to pay the relevant employer contributions for the period in question. There is no time limit on the period for which PRSI can be collected. An employer who knowingly and incorrectly classifies a worker as self-employed rather than employed in order to evade or reduce their liability to pay social insurance contributions may be guilty of an offence under Section 252 of the Social Welfare Consolidation Act 2005. An employer who aids, abets, counsels or procures an employee to misrepresent their employment status is also guilty of an offence under Section 251 of the Act. Any employer who fails to pay employment contributions and or makes false or misleading statements may also be guilty of an offence under the Act. Section 254 of the Act requires employers to keep records of employees and people engaged under contract for services. A person guilty of an offence is liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding €2,500 or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 6 months or to both, or on conviction or indictment to a fine not exceeding €13,000 or the amount that is equivalent to twice the amount so unpaid or deducted, whichever is the greater, or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years or to both. In addition to the work of social welfare inspectors in scope section, the Workplace Relations Commission has responsibility to promote and encourage compliance with relevant employment legislation. Notwithstanding what a contract says, if a worker thinks they are an employee and has a complaint about how they are treated in relation to employment rights or equality matters, they may bring a complaint to the Workplace Relations Commission. Complaints may be referred to mediation or adjudication, and either the mediation agreement or the decision of the adjudication officer are enforceable in the District Court. There are strong penalisation provisions in most employment rights legislation so that employees feel safe in enforcing their statutory rights. Members will be aware of the improvements in employment rights contained in our Employment Miscellaneous Provisions Bill, which is being brought to the Shannon shortly. Quantitative data from the Labour Force Survey and elsewhere indicates that the prevalence of false self-employment is lower than is perhaps perceived anecdotally. The self-employed make up under 15% of total employment. This is at the lowest level in 20 years for which data is readily available, is in line with the average rate of self-employment in the EU, and appears from the data that we have to be trending downward. The committee may be aware of the research published by the SRI in August, measuring contingent employment in Ireland. They looked at the prevalence of freelance self-employed with no employees in a number of sectors, including IT and finance. They concluded that while freelance employment has been increasing steadily since 1998, it remains a relatively minor component of the Irish labour market, accounting for just over 2% of total employment in 2016. The report on the implication for social insurance and tax receipts of intermediary employment structures and self-employment arrangements was published in January 2018. This report was prepared by officials from this department, the Department of Finance and the Revenue Commissioners, and informed by a public consultation with a wide range of stakeholders. The report noted that the available data does not indicate that self-employment is accounting for any significant increase of the labour force, and in fact the available data indicates that the proportion of self-employed people in the workforce is decreasing. The report also explored the use of intermediary employment arrangements as a mechanism through which workers are represented as engaged in self-employment. There are two main forms of intermediary structures used in lieu of a direct engagement between an end user of services and the person providing services: personal service companies and managed service companies. While the report noted that intermediary arrangements can be abused to the detriment of workers, it also noted that contract for service arrangements can provide flexibility in many instances for both businesses and workers where they are freely chosen by both parties. In many cases, the individuals involved are genuinely self-employed. However, there is only one end user of the services over a period of time. The relationship may be more akin to an employer-employee relationship. The worker in this instance does not have the protection of employment rights legislation. The report also noted that due to the difference in social insurance contribution rates, there is an incentive for employers to hire workers as self-employed rather than direct employees. It estimated potential losses based on various employment and earning scenarios. The potential loss to the state from various self-employment arrangements ranges from $5,000 per annum at average industrial earnings, $9,000 per annum at an earnings level of $60,000, and circa $15,000 per annum at a salary of $100,000. These type of arrangements are more common in certain industries across the developed world. You'll be familiar with their use in IT, media and aviation. Different countries have tried different approaches depending on their social insurance traditions. We continue to monitor approaches tested in other countries, including the recent developments in the UK, to ascertain if a new model may be required for dealing with people using these type of arrangements beyond the simple distinctions of employee or self-employed. Despite the data showing no upward trend in the numbers of self-employed, the issue of false self-employment continues to attract a lot of attention. There have been a number of private members' bills and amendment to the Employee Miscellaneous Provisions Bill in recent months seeking to address the issue. Much of what is attempted to do is already covered in existing legislation and case law, and they draw quite substantially from the current Code of Practice for determining employment and self-employment, and I'll return to the issue of the code shortly. In May 2018, the Department began a month-long media campaign costing $167,000 on false self-employment and the service provided by the Department's scope section. This followed a recommendation from the report on intermediary arrangements, which I've mentioned. The focus of the campaign was on the worker who is falsely self-employed, pointing out the implications of social welfare benefits and employment rights, such as holiday pay. The campaign consisted of radio ads, online ads, etc. The campaign directed people to a dedicated page, welfare.ie employment status, which includes information on the tests used to determine employment status and how to request a formal determination from the Department Scope section, as well as information about and contacts for the Workplace Relations Commission and Revenue, and the information was provided in 8 languages. The new web page attracted over 10,500 visits during the campaign, with an average time of over 3 minutes spent on the page, which is regarded as favourable given the general nature of online engagement. The Department engaged directly with ICTU, IBEC and the Construction Industry Federation to share information before the start of the campaign. Contact has been maintained with trade unions identifying specific employments that could be investigated further. I have to say that the level of direct contact with scope section as a result of the campaign was surprisingly low. In the event scope section received just 50 calls, 30 emails during the campaign from individuals who become aware of the service directly as a result of the ad campaign. A higher level of direct engagement had been expected given the extent of anecdotal information on false self-employment. The majority of callers confirmed that they had visited the website before contacting the department, and 15 formal applications just for scope decision were registered, but these included the types of employment such as couriers and van drivers, home tutors, meter readers, personal finance, IT, media, pharmaceuticals and construction. It has been suggested that one reason for the low response to the campaign is a reluctance by individuals to seek a scope determination due to concerns over how an employer might react. If this is the case, the most appropriate way to address this would be through inspection, but in addition, legislative measures dealing with victimisation may be required, similar to those that are already contained in employment rights legislation, to provide assurance to workers that they cannot be victimised if they raise legitimate concerns regarding their employment status. Although the response was low, the feedback from the campaign will inform the inspection work of the Department, the Revenue and the WRC, including in sectors other than construction. We intend repeating the media campaign on a periodic basis to keep awareness high, and engagement with the sector representatives bodies is ongoing. In response to the concerns expressed regarding potential employer misconduct, the Department's divisions have been engaged in planning employer inspections by social welfare inspectors based on the feedback we gathered during the media campaign. These will focus on the sectors identified and any companies reported to discord section. A targeted control week, which involved inspector visits to 967 employers across all sectors in Dublin Central, took place during the week the 23rd of July 2018. Separately, in conjunction with Revenue, a number of inspections in the construction and other sectors was carried out in the West in the second half of May 2018. The focus was on establishing the correct insurability status and on challenging any cases where dubious self-employment or subcontracting was suspected. Leaflets outlining the false self-employment campaign were issued to the main contractors and others as considered appropriate. Joint Revenue and Social Protection Special Investigation Unit inspections were undertaken in Galway City on the 10th of May in 3 substantial sites. A total of 163 people were interviewed on 3 sites. 10 of the workers were identified as self-employed contractors, subcontractors, of whom just one was supplying labour only. A follow-up investigation regarding insurability is underway in this case. Although not determinative in relation to the overall skill of the issue at a national level, the result of this inspection yielding just one suspected case of false self-employment is consistent with the labour force survey data, indicating that false self-employment may not be as common as the prevailing narrative suggests. A programme of intensive reviews of potential bogus self-employment in 2 further divisions, Dublin North and Midwest, will commence later this month. We are using different approaches in each division, partly to assess the best methodology for using it in other divisions. The Midwest is adopting a sector approach focusing on particular industries based on local knowledge. Dublin North will follow a geographical approach targeting particular areas, including industrial estates. I mentioned earlier that the Code of Practice for determining employment and self-employment status of individuals, this was drawn up by a government-appointed expert group in 2001, updated in 2007, with the view to encapsulating the criteria established over time for differentiating employment from self-employment. This code is in need of updating to take account of aspects of recent case law and the development of more complex areas of work, such as the use of intermediary employment arrangements, including the personal service and managed service companies, platform services, web-based work, etc., which may not be adequately addressed by the current code. A working group was established in August to look at updating the code, and we hope to have a draft available shortly. We intend consulting with employer and employee bodies before finalising the text. As part of our review, we will consider the feasibility of putting the code on a legislative basis, while ensuring that it continues to reflect the direction of the courts, that each of these cases must be looked at on an individual basis. In conclusion, in considering whether new measures may be required to tackle an issue such as false self-employment, we need to take due account of the available data and the evidence as to the prevalence and impact of the issue. We should also consider if there are existing measures already available in legislation which can be applied to address the issue. Finally, we need to be mindful of the labour market impacts of any new measure. One of the characteristic features of the Irish labour market is its flexibility, and the flexibility of the labour market, it has been argued, is one of the key features supporting employment recovery and growth in the post-recession period. The available data indicates the prevalence of self-employment is in fact diminishing and is now at its lowest recorded level over the past 20 years. there are already significant legislative powers to investigate and sanction employers and employees who falsely declare their social insurance status as self-employed rather than employed. On balance, the view of the Department is that, with the possible exception of anti-victimisation protections, there is already sufficient legislative provisions and powers to enable the State, and in particular its Department, to identify, investigate and enforce, including through criminal prosecutions, the false declaration of employment as self-employment. The Department considers the appropriate response at this time should be to increase the exercise of our existing investigative enforcement powers rather than seek individual powers or impose new and unnecessary restrictions on employment at this point, but we will continue to monitor and assess the position and the results of our increased focus on inspections. We welcome the fact that this committee is shining a light on the issue of false self-employment and look forward to receiving the final report. I am conscious that the deputies and senators often have local knowledge of employment issues on the ground, and we're always happy to investigate any specific cases that you might want to bring to our attention. We've made some general material available on the work of the scope section and the inspectors, and we're happy to answer any questions. And I should say that for reasons of confidentiality and data protection, we're not really able to discuss any individual cases. Thank you, Chairman, and I'm happy to take any questions from the committee. I'm
sure you'll have a number of questions. Thank you for your opening statement. Just one general question before I hand it over. You've gone through a whole process here. And if you look at, say, on page 1, you mentioned social welfare inspectors inspect a wide range of businesses. You go on to talk then that inspections are undertaken jointly with revenue commissioners. You talk about the fact that officials investigate specific cases referred to the department. You talk about the advertising campaign you had. You talk about the 163, or whatever the figure was, people who were interviewed, the 10 workers and whatever. Through all of the documentation and the presentation that you've made, you came down to saying, although not determined in relation to scale of result, that you yielded just one suspected case of false self-employment. Across 2018, how many cases were investigated and how many were seen as to be false or bogus self-employment? And I suppose the second question in relation to that is then, do you do random inspections and targeted information-led, evidence-based investigations?
I suppose we cover all of those because we do have inspectors, we have a special investigation unit, and we do have then joint investigation unit working with revenue and with the WRC inspectors. We have not been keeping specific stats on bogus and false self-employment. I suppose our operation is being built up and developed, and we are operating on the information that we receive. We're conscious, I suppose, because we're building up our information at the moment. I suppose, both the general inspections is being looked at and the targeted inspections as well. What I would say is that, and I suppose, and that was, my comment at the end in terms of where we stand at this moment in time, the overall statistics indicate that there is self-employment is generally kind of decreasing slightly over a period, but there would appear to be pockets or areas that we would need to focus on, and certain sectors that we do need to target, and we are... No, I don't want to get into the debate because others will ask. I suppose I'm being specific and I'm trying to find out, how many inspections did you carry out independently? And if you don't have them in front of you, you can forward them. And I have.
How many were found to produce bogus or self-employment?
In 2017, there was 2,698 employer reviews, 2.27 million in savings recorded. We do not, though, keep an absolute record of bogus self-employment. We haven't had those. We haven't been keeping those stats. I suppose I would be critical of that from the point of view that for the since the formation of, what are we on, the 32nd Dáil, this issue has been around the whole time, and that in terms of if you're doing inspections, whether they're targeted, specific, or whether they're random, and you have to do both to keep people honest. You have to have a random element as well as a target. I am surprised to learn
that you are not able to, you can tell how much money you believe you've saved, but not the number of bogus self-employment contracts that were there. I just make that the data needs to be more robust than that. I'll hand over to my colleagues. Deputy Brady.
Well, I think that point there that the department don't actually record how many cases of bogus self-employment, that's absolutely astonishing. That's unbelievable, because in your opening statement here, you cite several reports stating that the prevalence of self-employment isn't rife within this state. And how can you make a statement like that when you don't even actually keep the records? That's unbelievable. And I think, you know, it's certainly shining a light on the attitude of government and the department in actually tackling this serious, very serious issue that is growing. It's certainly not subsiding. It's growing on a daily basis, and there's more and more sectors being dragged into this fraud. And that's what it is. It is frauding the state. It's frauding the PRSI system. And ICTU reckon that over an 8-year period, and I'd ask you to comment on this, it has cost the state, and probably, I suppose, a low figure, €600 million. €600 million. That, by no means, is insignificant. So, firstly, I'll ask you to comment on that. That ICTU stated that in a report in 2015. €600 million in unpaid employer PRSI, and I can think of many groups of marginalised citizens in this state that could benefit massively from that, and I'm sure the department would welcome €600 million. It's fraud that is going on here, and it exposes this government. When we had Leo Varadkar out there with his social welfare fraud campaign, spending massive amounts of money, and the more substantial, and the figures bear it out, that the more substantial fraud that's going on within this state is with certain employers. And we see a measly 170,000 in, which has proven to be a shambolic campaign launched by the department and government around this area back in August, that received only 50 phone calls and 30 emails. You know, that just says it all in my mind. Just a few specific questions here. The number of inspections, I would be interested in finding out how many inspections have been carried out by social welfare inspectors this year, and how many inspections have been carried out by revenue commissioners and the WRC, Workplace Relations Commission. And I mean, just to go back to the point that, you know, you say it's not significant. I'm not sure as to whether you're aware of a report carried out in the media sector by Philip Boucher-Hayes. It was widely publicised, and he said, to quote, he says, "The phenomenon is endemic within the media sector. It's rife within the state broadcaster or RTE, and that certainly doesn't sound insignificant. And it's rife within the construction sector as well. And it's rife within public projects funded by the state. I'm talking about housing projects, I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about other state-funded capital projects happening across the state. And what's happening? People are being forced to register as self-employed. They're going in then as subcontractors, and not only are they missing out on their entitlements in terms of holiday pay, if they get sick and all of those other things. We've seen some examples only quite recently where contractors in receipt of state contracts, developing housing projects, going into examinership, going into receivership, and these people who had been forced to register as self-employed, as subcontractors, then are left high and dry. They're owed substantial amounts of money because they're being forced into this ludicrous scenario and situation in the first place. And we know as subcontractors, they're the last. They'll receive a couple of cent in the euro. So just a couple of questions there, because this needs to be addressed. And I'm aware that Solidarity people before Profit have brought forward legislation on this Sinn Féin totally support that. Can I ask, is it something that you as officials, are you aware with that, of that legislation? You know, because I think ultimately the only way to tackle this and deal with this is through legislation. You can cite other, you know, employment law on that. Clearly, it's not working. It hasn't worked. It will not work. We need distinct legislation on this. And the final point: have you looked at other countries as to how they've actually gone about tackling this fraud that is going on within their countries, that needs to be tackled in this state as well?
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Smith.
Thank you. I'm interested in the conclusion of your submission, where you say that we need to be mindful of the labour market impacts of any new measure. One of the characteristic features of the Irish labour market is its flexibility, and it has been argued that flexibility is one of the key factors supporting employment recovery and growth. Now, I think that remark itself says a lot about the determination of the Department to capture what is bogus self-employment and to understand it and to get the scale of it right, because there's something extraordinary about setting up a new web page that has 10,500 hits with 3 minutes on average spent on the page, and then getting a result on your scope section with just 50 calls and 30 emails. There's something wrong there. And I would suggest the problem is that bogus self-employment itself is not being captured because it creates a fear, it creates an oppression, and it creates an isolation, and it is being used increasingly to recruit and to exploit the labour of foreign workers, whether they come in here through agencies or they're resident here or they have become new members of our communities here. That is particularly the case. Now, those of us who are activists in our communities and in our trade unions, my trade union Unite has been tackling this for years, and I have attended pickets on all of them publicly financed projects. The National Children's Hospital, schools built, some of the schools that are controversial at the moment through Lucan and West Dublin, public housing projects, where the workers going on and off the site are bogusly self-employed. And instead of being on what is alleged the minimum wage, or indeed the construction industry norm of around 15 or 13 euro an hour, they end up actually earning about 4 or 5 euro an hour through that very process of having to create themselves as a letting on or a false company. And then they are paid a chunk of money without receiving any protection of unemployment benefit, sick benefit, and on top of that, generally speaking, they have to buy their own safety equipment and buy certs that will cover them to go on and off those sites, and these sites are antagonistic to trade union organisation. It's rampant, and to produce a document that said you can't prove that sounds like the department is being entirely ineffective in its pursuit of it. One question for you: have you had any single prosecution of a bogus self-employment incident? And have you any more than a single one? How many have you had? And can we pursue more of these in order to go after them? Because your legislative procedures seem to be very, very weak. Your determination leaves a lot to be desired. But you talk here about the best way for us to proceed is identify, investigate and enforce through criminal prosecutions the false declaration of employment as self-employment. But we need to know what results you're getting in terms of prosecutions. And I note at the end that you said you're unable to discuss individual cases. Well, I think we're going to have to discuss, even if it's in broad sweep terms, we're going to have to discuss the construction industry, the amount of abuses in the construction industry that are taking place through state money that's been given to build the National Children's Hospital is the best example I can use. But I also want to ask you, because it's been publicly shared and known because of the response in industrial relations terms, do you consider the way Ryanair employs most of its pilots as bogus self-employment? In other words, that each pilot is employed on the basis of there you are, John Brady, go off and set up a company called John Brady Limited and engage an accountant from these companies, and we're telling you which ones to engage, and we will pay you through that. But you do not get to pay your PRSI, your taxes, in the country you work in. which has led to certain Ryanair pilots being arrested in Germany or Britain by the revenue there because their taxes are being paid in Ireland rather than those countries. They benefit from the social structures in those countries and they're not contributing to the PRSI system. Do you consider that to be bogus self-employment? Or if you don't, then what is your description of bogus self-employment? Because I certainly would, the Ryanair pilots certainly do, and in fact it has been described as social dumping. The cost to the state in the construction industry, figures are already given by Congress, but there's massive cost to the state in the airline industry and beyond, and you list a lot of industries there. You don't, however, list the airline industry, and I would argue that there's a big offence taking place there.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. Just one comment to colleagues. Some of the questions and some of the issues that you raise, while the Department may have a view on it, other witnesses will certainly have a view on it. So just bear in mind that we will have other relevant issues as this issue proceeds. The Department may have some view on some of the issues, but not all of it. So just to bear that in mind. Senator Higgins.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentations. I think there's a few. I mean, I would share the shock of my colleagues that this issue is not being monitored. I think it's completely unacceptable, especially if it was not monitored previously. That given when the department's heading was redetermined in terms of being social protection and employment, this is a key piece of work. It means that you don't even have a baseline to move from. And I would suggest that, given that the Social Welfare Bill is moving through shortly, that resources should be allocated to forensically seek to recreate information and to find information and to look, if necessary, to individual correspondences from the Department in respective cases to give a much more accurate and detailed picture. I had a number of just kind of key specific questions as well. Others have asked about the numbers of prosecutions that have been taken. So again, that's not the number of determinations, that's not the number of cases, that's the number of prosecutions. And it's mentioned extensively in your own presentation, the question of prosecution in respect of fraud. And I had a concern, because one of my key concerns, and it does arise from a particular case, but I won't be mentioning that case or specific, but more speaking to the issues which arise in relation to it. I've seen a detailed account, and indeed most of it was in the public realm, in respect of a key case over, I think, now over 18 years ago. But important because, of course, as you mentioned yourselves, there is no time limit in respect of these issues, and it's very important that there's no time limit. It's appropriate that there's no time limit, because bear in mind, this is not simply hurting people in the moment. It's not simply hurting people if they become unemployed. When you deny somebody their PRSI contributions or their proper contributions, you are effectively impoverishing them into old age and into their retirement, because you're denying them a proper pension record. So it's a very significant damage that is done. And also, I would note, again, this is from your own slideshow. We've heard the figures from the unions, which are very high, and are probably I would expect, because they do have contact with so many members, are very accurate. But even to just simply return to your own figures, the potential loss of per worker from self-employment arrangements may be up to from 5,000 to 15,000 per worker per year to the state. The potential gains, if action was to be taken, are estimated by yourself as 30 to 60 million per annum. It's a very significant cost to the state. So in this an example case which was moved through, we had a situation whereby the scope unit found that somebody was in fact an employee. It was appealed to the Social Welfare Appeals Office. Determination was made by the Social Welfare Appeals Office based on a social welfare inspector report, and an individual was cited. A member of staff of the relevant company was cited at great length in that determination, in that decision. Later, and indeed, the decision of the Scope Office was overturned. Subsequently, a case was taken by the employee to the Employment Appeals Tribunal, in which the company said that in fact the stated member of staff of the company had never been met with by the social welfare inspector. And this was later admitted by the department because they said that there had been a mistaken identity on the part of the social welfare inspector. Yet, no change or no overturning by the chief appeals officer was made in relation to the determination. And you had a situation where the individual in question, bear in mind the person with the least power, the most to lose, the most vulnerable in the situation, was in a situation where they had to try to take cases to the High Court rather than the Circuit Court, because the channel, the appropriate channels of Employment Appeals Tribunal had been effectively closed off to them by a misrepresentation by the Department of Social Welfare, who also then did not change their own appeal. So this is an example, but let's not dwell on the details. I'm sure you'll tell me that you cannot speak to them. What I want to know is how many determinations by the scope unit are overturned by the Social Welfare Appeals Office. What is the legal basis in terms of the determinations that are made by the Social Welfare Appeals Office as opposed to those made by the scope unit? What are the plans when a situation is being determined to later have been based on inaccurate information? What actions will be taken, perhaps in this instance or in other instances? Is there a policy in respect of seeking to find the monies? I know I've actually four really specific, these are just questions.
Good.
Another question is a key question as well in respect of the engagement between the department and the Department of Revenue. For example, in situations where revenue is engaging with the company, in fact, in relation to failure to deliver their full tax component, what is the relationship between the department in respect of PRSI? Can we be assured that in any, for example, deal or arrangement or compensatory...
Senator, look, if they're either brief or I'll come back to you because...
Okay, they are very brief. My other question was in relation to scope determinations in respect of spouses. Can I ask, is that in relation to the EU directive that came in about 3 years ago, which directed that persons in family businesses should pay PRSI in respect of their spouses? And I might ask how that's been evolving and how that has been pushed forward. Okay, that's fine. I'll come back if I have a further one.
Deputy Murphy.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the committee for taking this issue up. I have to say that, I mean, I also, like the other members, are shocked by the idea that the department is not keeping records of bogus self-employment. It's the definition of putting your head in the sand when you have this massive perceived issue. I accept the fact that the department is saying that the perception is greater than the reality. I'd be very surprised if that turns out to be the case, say with the benefit of hindsight in 10 years' time or so. If you look at what's happening internationally, this is a huge issue, which various governments, parties, etc. are moving to try to deal with because of the expansion of bogus self-employment. 12% of workers in Ireland are self-employed with no employees. That doesn't mean they're all bogus self-employed, but it certainly opens up the possibility that they're bogus self-employed. And the information from trade unions and others would suggest that there's a huge level of bogus self-employment in a few specific sectors, in construction, in delivery, in couriers, in those kind of areas. And that's quite a lot of workers. Just in terms of more specific questions, to kind of follow on from Alice Mary, I think that question of the overturning of scope decisions is pretty important. So if we could get those figures in absolute terms and also in percentage terms of scope decisions finding that people are employees and then Social Welfare Appeals Office overturns that, I think that would be extremely important. Another question which perhaps is out of the realm of your department, and I'll be trying to bring it up in finance because it might be more relevant there, but are there tax rulings by revenue for particular industries or for particular companies saying that we consider workers in this area to be self-employed? And if it was found that those rulings were not accurate, were not legally sound, is it the case that that would amount to illegal state aid, similar to how the EU Commission has found that the tax ruling by revenue with Apple amounted to that, whereby those who are engaging, if they are at the benefit of bogus self-employment, they obviously make a substantial saving, perhaps around 30%. And the I had a final question, but it's gone from me in a second. I'll leave it at that. If it goes back to me, I'll ask.
Thank you for the moment. Thank you, Deputy Murphy. Ms. Murphy,
sorry, it came back to me. If I could just, whether the Social Welfare Appeals Office, does the Social Welfare Appeals Office rely on the Code of Practice for determining employment or self-employment status of individuals from the employment status group when making determinations? Does that rely on it? Does Scope not rely on it? And if it does, what's the legal basis to rely on that as opposed to the relevant legislation? Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. Ms. Murphy, just before you reply, there were a number of specific questions asked, and you might indicate if you don't have the specific answers with you today, you can correspond with the committee. This piece of work with the committee will be going on. So some of them were detailed. If you don't have the numerical answers, that's not a problem. Identify it and submit it to the committee. That will be satisfactory. Ms. Murphy.
Okay, I hope I have them, but I may not have. I'll do my best. If there's anything that I have missed, do definitely raise it with me. Because I just, on a general basis, we are very happy to see kind of scrutiny on this issue. There's no doubt about it. There is an issue there. The department hasn't specific stats, as we have said, but we are kind of carefully, we are very much in monitoring and engagement mode with ICTU and any other representative bodies, and working very closely with the inspector operation on this. It's difficult for me to comment on the specific figure put forward by ICTU, but we do accept that there is a loss to the Exchequer, specifically from employers' PRSI, and also a loss to the individual in terms of the employment rights in relation to bogus self-employment. There is, in the context of somebody, a worker paying PRSI Class S as opposed to PRSI Class A, they are still building up contributions for a state pension contributory into the future, just to mention that. With regard to the number of inspections that have been done, up to September this year, there were 1,465 employer reviews with savings of 2.7 million done by this department. I have figures for joint work with revenue of 855 visits in 2017, with, I think, overall collection, which would include PAYE, of 60.2 million in the construction sector, which has always been a focus for the inspectorate. In the WRC in 2017 carried out 4,747 inspections in respect of 99,000 employees and had unpaid wages of 1.7 million. So I suppose that is the general, I suppose, lie of the land in relation to inspections. In terms of the awareness campaign, the department we were ramped up and prepared for a much bigger individual response, and really were surprised, and this is, I suppose, just in May this year, the inspectors were all at the ready to immediately go out on the foot of awareness campaign, and we were kind of saying that in terms of our press releases at the time. So we do accept there is an issue, and as you have said yourselves, it does appear to be in pockets of areas. It does make I suppose, it is more difficult when individuals don't come forward to report it, because we were encouraging people to come forward. It identified to ourselves that we do need to have this anti-victimisation, anti-penalisation measures in our own legislation and replicate those measures that are in the employment rights legislation at the moment, because there is a fear factor there. So from the message that we took back ourselves, that the need to get our inspectors into the right areas is very important, and it may be that the concentration may be geographic as much as, sectoral, and this is, I think, why we welcome this committee to look at it, because we can get feedback from yourselves and from other bodies speaking here as to where we can usefully. We do have a big operation. We are ramping up specifically on the space, because the inspectors will look at kind of the non-payment of PRSI and other areas. and we will be increasing the focus on the insurability aspect, I think, as we ramp up more and more. Just on the prosecutions, the department itself has not taken a criminal prosecution against employers because we have in fact used, as in our joint operations, the powers available under the Tax Acts to attach and apply administrative penalties which are far greater than those under the Social Welfare Acts. So working jointly with Revenue, we've used Revenue powers to ensure employer compliance with the PRSI obligation. It avoids a duplication of the compliance penalty, and we consider it to be at this time more effective and timely. And that is, I think, the approach that has been taken by the control area at the moment. So that, as we have said, there were 60.2 million overall collected from employers in 2017, and that is the current approach that's been taken. Let me see, just so I've covered the prosecution sector. We have in relation, in relation to spouses, the law was changed to allow a spouse who does ancillary work to make Class S contributions. So I think that is in place. Your queries on the appeals, I'll have to provide you with the data. I'll have to correspond with you separately on that to provide that information. In terms of our relationship with Revenue, the department has a memorandum of understanding with Revenue. They act as our agents in terms of collection of PRSI. We have a higher level group with Revenue that meets very regularly, and we work through a pile of issues, and we engage very closely with them, and we've actually been meeting them with them very regularly on this particular issue at the moment, with the view to obtaining sectoral data, as well as that as to where we can kind of focus both the department's individual operations and our joint operations with agencies as well. In relation to any particular the case, I think Deputy Higgins that you mentioned, the person can come back to the deciding officer for a revised decision if there's any particular change in facts. Scope section is in fact dealing with the case, has an active case at the moment, I think, involving Ryanair. I'm not sure if we can kind of comment just any further though in relation to that, but that is it's on appeal at the moment, so it's in process. I think if there's anything else. State aid is something, unfortunately, it's probably dealt with by the Department of Finance and Revenue. I wouldn't just be able to respond on that. In terms of the appeals office, and it's reliant on the code outlines the various tests in relation to determining employment to self-employment. They're fundamental. So the appeals officer would rely on that, but the facts of each, and I think the courts have shown for any case involving the correct rate of PRSI that's payable, or it's the facts of each case, and the tests and how they're applied is actually critically important. The code outlines these, and as we said, we're currently updating it. So both scope section and the appeals office will rely on those particular tests and the facts of the employment as they receive them. And I think that's actually goes as well to the heart of the legislation issue and why it's possibly difficult to legislate for this area, because it has to have, the legislation has to have the flexibility to allow the tests to be applied to the facts of the individual employment, and each individual employment situation or contract will vary. Each one is absolutely different. I actually worked in scope section, so I would have dealt with a lot of them. So the tests are standard, even though I suppose the labour market changes, but how they're applied can change. So I think the legislation piece has to be very sensitively approached.
Ms Murphy, I'll come back to you in just, colleagues, in just 1 second. Ms Murphy, I just want to raise 2 points with you. First of all, the awareness campaign, where 10,000 people went to the website, and the number of people then who engaged further after that should set alarm bells off. And the reason is people are unprepared to report their own situation for fear of losing their employment or their work. And that should come out loud and clear. You indicated the number of inspections that were carried out and the financial yield. I suppose the particular questions that I'd like to get to the detail of, from what you're saying, there are two types of inspections. Inspections that you do on your own or you do jointly with Revenue or WRC. What are the criteria around how do you decide, how do you determine? Are they random, purely random, or are they evidence-based, targeted inspections? And what is that programme? In other words, and you mentioned whether it's geographic or sectoral. We don't have the information here, but you have been carrying them out for some period of time. And surely to God, the information you get from one year to the next informs the decision-making about where you're going to carry those inspections out. So you had a particular yield in construction, whether it's in terms of and construction in a geographic area, and that informs. For example, Revenue do exactly that. They have targeted audits. They have random audits, but they have very specific targeted audits year on year. And should you not be doing exactly the same in terms of the inspections that you're carrying out? A set number of inspections, know how many, and then what is the outcome in terms of the number of people who are determined to have had bogus self-employment contracts?
Actually, I'll ask Jim Lynch, one of the divisional managers, to respond to you on that.
Yeah, Chair, just to comment that we actually do both. We do random and we actually do targeted. What actually feeds us a lot is intelligence that we receive. So if an employee comes to us, if they're actually looking to access benefits or there's been a breakdown in communication with their employer, and they'll, what should we say, fill in a form with us.
Let me interrupt you. That's different. That's a person making a complaint.
Yeah.
I'm talking about you going... I'm trying to make that distinction. Instead of following a complaint that an individual makes, I'm talking about policing the system generally, where there are no complaints made, where you're monitoring sector by sector, geographically and...
Yes, Chair, the point I was making is that actually those level of complaints actually informs thinking, and it informs our interventions afterwards. But equally then we can do, and we do what we call streetscape employment, where we'll do, let's say, high street or targeted interventions on particular sectors or anything along that line. So we do random selection, and we also do targeted selection.
Determine which are on your own and which are Revenue.
That's a matter for if we come across customers or clients that are not complying, and we'll liaise with Revenue and we'll see if Revenue have an issue with them, then we'll target them jointly with Revenue. And Revenue will do similar with us from the point of view of joint investigation.
Just to mention, and it's in response to one of the questions earlier, we do focus, say, the Education Capital Building Programme, and the inspectors looked at the larger sites and projects there, so and we kind of liaised with the Department of Education and Skills in relation to where we could target those inspections. So we do that type of targeted approach in relation to particular areas.
Smith.
I want to come back to the question of inspections and prosecutions, because we know you're saying you do random and individual inspections, but we don't know what those inspections entail. So, for example, could you walk into a building site, let's say at the National Children's Hospital tomorrow, and go straight to the contractor and say, I want to see your books, I want to see who's paying what and who's employed where. And if you do that with a deal of scrutiny, I think you would come up with a much tighter report than what you've given us here, because the conclusions in your report is that the prevalence of self-employment is in fact diminishing. I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Even in my own life, I know so many people who are caught in bogus self-employment as a way of making their living, whether it's in the food industry, the airline industry, the construction industry, whatever. I just do not believe that you cannot do better than this and collect data and have in front of us something that is meaningful. And therefore, I really do question the level of inspection, what it entails, because if it's anything like this report, then it's pretty poor. The other thing I'd like to ask you is on state contracts, because there's a huge amount of money goes out on state contracts for schools, hospitals and other buildings, and a huge amount of bogus self-employment takes place in those building sites and in those construction sites. Does the state, or can you as a department, ensure that into those contracts is put a series of guarantees and penalties that this contractor will not employ on bogus self-employment terms? If you don't do it, could you please look at doing it, because I think it would be a deterrent. If not, it should lead to proper prosecutions if it's broken. And secondly, I just want you to tell me again, has the Department of Social Protection ever prosecuted on the basis of bogus self-employment? Because what I heard, you said it quite quickly, was that you've done it, but not as a department. It's gone through revenue. And if you have, how many times and whom have you prosecuted?
Senator Higgins.
Yes, so just in terms of the success of the outreach campaign, I'm just quoting from your own slideshow presentation here, that there was evidence that people want anonymity and fear repercussions. So I think it's important that we don't say that we're surprised. I think we say there was disturbing evidence from your own report that this was the issue that came to the light, and I think that needs to be really addressed. And in that context, that's why the issue I raised earlier, not so much necessarily even in relation to that specific case, but the question of the Employment Appeals Tribunal and issues such as constructive dismissal and so forth. These are, I would like if you could provide us just with information as to what the intersection has been between people who have attempted to take cases, for example, there, and people who have sought rulings from yourselves. I think it's a real pity that we don't have the information in respect of the appeals. I think it's a very surprising information, because that's information located within your department in terms of how many of the 1,097, for example, scope decisions of 2017 were taken to an appeal stage. I think that's something that should have been in the presentation, frankly. The spouse's Class S contribution, what I was asking in respect of that is I'm just wondering, in terms of what is bringing it to Scope's attention, is Scope proactively seeking this issue? Are we relying on individual appeals? Is there a campaign of awareness? Because this is a huge category of persons who are now entitled to PAYE contributions and who should be PRSI contributions and who should be supported in that. You mentioned a memorandum of understanding with revenue. I don't know if that's something that can or appropriately be shared with the committee, but I imagine it would address some of the issues of concerns or perhaps a summary of it. I think it's really important, for example, in respect of that concern of, can we be assured that in a situation where there is an investigation or a joint thing, that PRSI, the full PRSI complement for each employee is made central in terms of what's done. And just lastly, in respect of Deputy Smith's issue in terms of contracts, just to mention I have legislation pending on that myself, but I think it's a really important issue, and there is an obligation for compliance under EU procurement rules with ILO standards and with clear directives. So in that regard, I would regard it as highly appropriate that there would be such clauses.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy Brady.
Just a few points there. Just in relation to the inspections, random and targeted inspections, I think it would be very useful for the committee if we could get a breakdown sector by sector, of where those inspections were carried out. There seems to be a heavy emphasis on construction, which is welcome because it is rife there, but it's also rife in other areas, and it would be very useful to see over, say, the last 5 years how many targeted random inspections have been carried out by social protection, revenue, WRC, because I think, as I stated earlier on, Philip Boucher-Hayes in his report said it is endemic within RTE, and I'd love nothing more than to see social protection, revenue, WRC all roll up to RTE to carry out targeted inspections. If it hasn't happened, it should happen. No sector should be immune from it, so that would be useful if we could get that. Just in relation to the fact that social protection, there have been no prosecutions against anyone in relation to that it's done through revenue. I think that's interesting. And I'd ask the question as to whether the penalties that are in place, do they need to be looked at and strengthened in terms of the welfare? So I'd appreciate a comment on that. The last thing there, and I mentioned a bill that has been brought forward, and just to get your views on that, because I think, there are massive concerns there. People actually reporting, bringing cases against their bosses or whatever because of the repercussions. I firmly believe that, this anti-victimisation legislation, that's all fine, that's all welcome, but it isn't going to address it. There needs to be specific standalone legislation. So I ask for a specific view on that. And the last point, and I think it's a very interesting point that my colleague made in terms of the contracts, for state contracts for schools, for housing projects, for hospitals. And I know there can be provision inserted in those contracts, say, to ensure that there's a certain amount of apprentices taken on in relation to those projects. A certain number of, local people have to be employed as part of that. So, measures can be put in place and built into that, into those contracts. So it'd be interesting. I think it would be useful to get a view on that. If it hasn't happened, it needs to happen. Because that is another way, in tandem with legislation, that needs to be put in place to tackle this once and for all.
Ms Murphy, finally, just my own comment to conclude, and then I'll refer to you. You have mentioned a number of times that the prevalence of self-employment is in fact diminishing. That is not what we're investigating. We're investigating bogus self-employment. So I think we need to be very clear and not to be repeating the same line over and over, that prevalence is diminishing. And on that point where you talk about prevalence and the prevalence of self-employment is diminishing, it's diminishing because total employment is increasing. So the reality is, you say on page 3, self-employed people make up 15% of the total employment. That's still well over 300,000 people. So the raw number, the actual number of people may be exactly the same as it was 5 and 10 years ago, and certainly may well be more, while the chart shows a decline from, I think you go back to 1998. In terms of numbers of people, the numbers who are self-employed, while a smaller percentage, are every bit as great as they were in 1998. So while I acknowledge the prevalence, that is a play on words. We're talking about bogus employment, bogus self-employment contracts is what the committee is focusing on. And yes, while the prevalence in terms of the total population is diminished, there is still a substantial number of people. 15% of 2.2 million workers, or whatever it is, would be 330,000. It is a significant number of people who are self-employed, and we're looking at the bogus self-employment. So while the prevalence, I don't want that bit to be overplayed, that the prevalence is diminishing. There is still a substantial number of people. That's the point I'm trying to make. Ms Murphy, sorry, over to you.
Just to address the points that were raised, I mentioned earlier that the inspectors had, gone into the area of schools where kind of there's construction going on there, and had liaised with the Department of Education on that. There would be obviously a requirement for compliance by any contractors, but the department we can certainly look at engaging right across with different bodies to ensure that compliance is being observed, and that's something I'll follow up on.
Sorry, is there anything in the contracts that would you know?
Not offhand, I just wouldn't know, but I think it is something that we can actually actively, engage with at a senior level to ensure that there is compliance in this area. I can just point to this in terms of the inspections and where we have focused. Healthcare, retail sector, hospitality, bar and hotel, engineering works, English schools for foreign nationals, catering sector, state bodies, charity sector, diplomatic sector, and kind of delivery services. And these are sectors that... Yes,
please.
I can, yeah.
The figures would be very useful. Just
as Deputy Brady
over the last 5 years or so.
Yeah. And just in terms of prosecutions, while we haven't prosecuted at the moment, we did have prosecutions of employers, say a small number of them, 2 in 2016, 8 in 2015, but this is in terms of PRSI, and I can't say specifically if there was bogus self-employment in there. It may have been part of it. I just don't have the detail of each of those individual cases. But just at this point, unfortunately, I can't do that. In terms of the spouse's Class S contribution, there's no scope decision required. Just in relation to the query that was mentioned, PRSI Class S is just simply employed by the individuals involved. I'm not aware that we have made an awareness campaign, but there would be general information available, on our website in relation to anybody who has a query in relation to that. the one area I'm conscious I just didn't address earlier on was the international situation. And countries are kind of grappling, I suppose, with this issue, where we are aware in relation to ourselves. A number of countries appear to have, or well, the UK have legislation in place in relation to, I suppose, the end user ultimately paying the contribution, and that's also a recommendation that we had in our intermediary report. In this budget that they just have, they have made this, I suppose, provision applied to the private sector. It was previously, I think, confined to the public sector. In the context, I suppose, of where we are, we have our own, I suppose, legislation which we can use more fully. I think we're quite clear on that. The department, we can be very focused on ensuring customers that get paid. We are increasing our focus all the time in employers. And I suppose I do want to emphasise that it is work in progress in terms of I suppose building up our own and our joint operations specifically in this area. But we have that recommendation from the intermediary report. Any legislation that is potentially introduced in this area always requires enforcement. We have to have the enforcement, we have to have the boots on the ground, we have to have the people in with the employers and interviewing the workers involved, because if the workers aren't coming forward, we have to be in there. I think no matter what legislation is in place, we did do a review of our legislation. It is quite broad, but we do have, we believe at the moment we have the powers we need, but if we don't, we will introduce them then in that case. I was asked just to comment on the private members' bills, and we have looked at them, and I think it is getting that balance right. We don't want to inhibit people, I suppose, getting work. We want to ensure that they pay the correct PRSI, that they have the full employment rights that they're absolutely entitled to. So it is getting that balance, and while we are currently looking at the code of practice, we are looking to see, should we put the code on some type of statutory basis? And it would be a way of maybe possibly looking at requiring employers to look at the code before somebody starts work or enters into a contract. It has just to be done in a way that it doesn't say, for example, maybe inhibit, maybe unfairly deal with people who are genuinely self-employed. So there are a lot of genuinely self-employed people there that we don't want to get caught up in a situation where they are maybe labelled as maybe being, I suppose, falsely self-employed. So it is getting that balance. So. Thank
you very much, Ms. Murphy. A number of questions, particularly around the inspections that Deputy Brady asked for. You might provide those to the committee. As I indicated in private session before the committee started, this is the start of a process. We will have other witnesses who will have information. It is an issue of grave concern because, I suppose, as we look to the future, not just where we are today, the role of an employee and I suppose the protections and what an employee might expect from an employer, especially when the likes of auto-enrolment pensions are rolled out, will vary. And so it is quite important that those lines are very, very clear, and that workers clearly are defined as either self-employed appropriately or in employment with the benefits that go with that. And that's a piece of work that will take a number of months for this committee to do. So I'd like to thank you for, I suppose, opening the scene for us today and setting out, I suppose you have left us with as many questions as answers at this stage. But thank you for your attendance. And we will be in touch with you as the committee goes forward on this issue. Colleagues, we're going to stand adjourned until Thursday, the 22nd of November at 10 a.m. Thank you very much. John Brady.